Good afternoon. It's time to begin our regular halacha shiur. Last week, we started to talk about the details governing the lighting of Ner Hanukkah, and we're going to continue with that issue today. Let me see if I can get the material on the screen.
I think, would you be able to post it to the chat as well so we can print
I did. It should be on chat. You don't see it on chat? On my screen, it's on chat. You don't have it? I'll do it again. Yeah, I did it a second time. It should be on chat.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. What I want to speak about this evening, this afternoon, whatever time zone you're in, what I want to talk about now is a slightly different issue, the issue of Zman Hadlaka. When are you supposed to light? And as with so many issues, as with almost every issue in halacha, not only is there a controversy about the time you're supposed to light, but the controversy is going to teach us some fundamental principles which have broad application throughout the length and breadth of Torah. So let's first see the different opinions about when you should light, and then we'll see what this teaches us about general principles that have application in every area of halacha. We begin with the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is quite definitive. Shulchan Aruch says, "Ein madlikim ner Hanukkah kodem shetishka hachama." You shouldn't light ner Hanukkah before the sun sets. For only after sunset, well, not only after sunset, Elaim sof shkiata, at the end of sunset. Now, if you think about it for a moment, you realize that this expression, the end of sunset, the time when you're supposed to light Ner Hanukkah, the end of sunset, is a peculiar, unusual, weird expression. After all, shkiyat hachama, the setting of the sun, is in general understood as the point in time when the top of the disk of the sun disappears beneath the horizon. As long as some of the disk of the sun is visible, it's not yet sunset. Sunset is exactly one point in time when the disk of the sun, the top of the disk of the sun, disappears beneath the horizon. Similarly, Hanetzach Hama, sunrise, is when the first bit of the top of the sun appears on the eastern horizon. Sunrise and sunset are one point in time, and therefore the expression sof hashkia doesn't make a lot of sense. It needs some kind of explanation. Well, here comes the explanation. Now, I know that what I'm about to tell you flies in the face of what Mrs. Cohen might have taught you about the movement of the moon, the movement of the sun and the moon back in the third grade. But let's understand the underlying astronomical concept, and then we'll see how to apply it in reality. There are two theories among the Rishonim regarding the maslul, the path that the sun takes. Of course, everyone knows that the sun rises in the east, travels overhead at noontime, and sets in the west. That part of the path of the sun is perfectly clear. But then the question arises, what happens to the sun after it has set below the western horizon? According to many authorities, led by Rabbeinu Tam, what happens is after the sun has set beneath the horizon, beneath the western horizon, the sun makes a right turn and starts moving away from the earth. Rises, sets, makes a right turn and starts moving away from the earth and penetrates through a tunnel, penetrates through the firmament, through the rakia, makes another right turn and starts moving over the rakia, over the firmament, back to the east. And this then is the root of the sun, according to Rabbeinu Tam and many other authorities. Now, I know this flies in the face of what you might have been taught in primary school, but the rabbis who follow this approach have a number of proofs that they are right. For example, the temperature of well water tends to decrease in the course of the evening. Well water is closest, well water, the water in the wells is coolest just before sunrise, implying that the sun is not underneath the earth, heating the well water from beneath. It must be passing over the firmament to get back to the east. Now, I understand that this does not account for those who live in the Antipodes, but we'll have to deal with them on another occasion. The reason that this theory is important is not so much for defining sunset. The reason this theory is important, or more important, is for defining the appearance of the stars. Let's think about it for a moment and you'll understand. The appearance of the stars at night depends upon how dark it is outside. The darker it is, the more stars you will see. If it's not very dark, you won't see many stars. Now, when the sun sets beneath the horizon, it's still pretty light outside. Even though the disk of the sun is not visible at all, you can still read a newspaper outside. There's plenty of reflected sunlight coming from above, and as the angle of declination increases, as the angle of the sun beneath the horizon gets deeper and deeper and deeper, it gets darker and darker and darker, and at some point, the stars appear. Of course, it's first the big stars, and then the middle-sized stars, and then the small stars eventually appear. The official definition of Tzeit Kochavim is when 3 middle-sized stars appear. According to Rabbeinu Tam, this does not happen until the sun passes through the tunnel and starts rising again on the other side of the firmament. Therefore, according to Rabbeinu Tam, Shkia is a long process, beginning with the disappearance of the sun beneath the horizon. That's not even the real beginning of Shkia. The real beginning of Shkia occurs a little bit after the sun has disappeared beneath the horizon and the sun makes the right turn and starts moving away from the earth. That's the beginning of Shkia. Shkia ends a little bit later when the sun makes another right turn and starts going over the Rikia. This is the understanding of Rabbeinu Tam, and this is the understanding which is embraced by the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says, "Lo me'acharim velo makdimim." One should light candles precisely at this time. We're going to have to figure out what that means on modern clock in a moment, but the lighting should be exactly at the right time. Yesh misha omer, some people say, Sheimu tarud, that if you're unable to light the Ner Hanukkah at exactly the right time, and we're going to define this more precisely in a moment, if you can't do it exactly at the right time at the end of Shkia, then it's okay. Yachol hakdim, you can do it earlier, not later. You can do it earlier, before sunset. Meplag mincha lamala, from the time of plag mincha. Plag mincha is 1 1/4 relative hours before sunset. You divide sunrise, the period from sunrise to sunset. You divide that period into 12 equal parts. Each is a relative hour. In the summer, relative hours are longer. In the winter, relative hours are shorter. And 1.25 relative hours before sunset, that's called Plag Mincha, and that's the earliest time you can light Ner Hanukkah. It's also the earliest time you can light Ner Shabbos for Shabbos candles. So one should light Ner Hanukkah according to the Shulchan Aruch exactly at the end of Shkia. If that's impractical, you're too busy, you're doing something else, so do it earlier. Do it in the late afternoon from Plag Mincha onwards. As long as you have enough oil in the lamp so that the oil will continue to burn until the people have left the marketplace. After all, the people are finishing up their last business in the marketplace and want to scurry home before it really gets dark. And that's the time when you can do Pirsum Hanes. If you're lighting earlier than the precise moment, you need enough oil so that it will burn until the people have left the marketplace and have gotten home. If you're lighting at precisely the right time, you need less oil because the interval of time needed is going to be less. Now, what we know is you have to light Ner Hanukkah at Sof Hashkia, the end of Shkia. What is Sof Hashkia exactly? Well, the Mishnah Brura defines it as follows. Hainu, namely, Tzeta Kochavim. When the sun makes that right angle going back over the rakia, that's the time when the stars are all visible. That's what the Shulchan Aruch means. Shulchan Aruch means, when it says Sof Hashkia, the Shulchan Aruch means light Ner Hanukkah at Tzeta Kochavim, when the stars come out. It's easy enough to look at a calendar because that corresponds exactly with the time that Shabbos is over every week. Look at what time Shabbos is over that week, and you'll get, within a minute or two, you'll get the correct time and the only correct time for lighting Ner Hanukkah according to the Shulchan Aruch. If you're unable to light at that time, light earlier from Plag Mincha. Az ha'am ovrim v'shavim v'roim b'bayit v'ika pirsumei nisa. That's the time when people are scurrying home and they will notice your Ner Hanukkah and you will accomplish Pirsum Hanes, publicizing the miracle. Achin be'erev Shabbos, maktimim. Of course, on Erev Shabbos, you can't wait until Tzeta Kochavim to light candles. And on Shabbos, you have to light before sunset begins. And therefore, on Erev Shabbos, you have no choice to light Ner Hanukkah sometime between Plag Mincha and the beginning of sunset. You'll first light Ner Hanukkah, then you'll light Ner Shabbos in that order. Now, Mishnah Berurah continues and says, the Shulchan Aruch is going according to the opinion of the Tur, which is the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam that I explained to you, with this unusual understanding of the movement of the sun. Masha Amar b'Gemara Dizman Hadlakat Ner Hanukkah U'Mishetishka Chama Hainu Sof Hashkia. The Shulchan Aruch is following this opinion. Well, be'emet, in truth, the Mishnah Berurah says, Harbe Rishonim Sfira Lahu de Kavanat Gemara Hu Al Tchilas Hashkia Hashnia. Many poskim reject this whole idea of the sun moving in this route. Many poskim have the bizarre idea that the sun sets in the west, continues underneath the earth, and rises in the east. Many poskim have that bizarre idea, and therefore those poskim are holding that shkia means shkia, and therefore the correct time to light is when the disk of the sun disappears beneath the horizon. The moment the top of the disk of the sun is beneath the horizon, that's the moment when you should light. And there's around a quarter-hour difference between these two opinions. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says. Of course, if you look on your calendars, you'll find that the interval of time between sunset and Shabbos being over is greater than 15 minutes. Well, it really depends on your latitude. It depends on the latitude you're at. Some people daven Ma'ariv at night. Now, this might sound to you strange. You probably thought everyone davens Ma'ariv at night. But the truth is that in all Jewish communities, everywhere, from antiquity, from the earliest antiquity until the 17th century, all Jews in all Jewish communities everywhere davened Ma'ariv before night. They davened after Plag Mincha, that's true, but before sunset when it was still fully light outside. The reason they did this was because they wanted to get home before it got dark. And it was quite customary, not customary, it was the universal practice in all Jewish communities to daven Mincha and then Ma'ariv before sunset. That was true until the 17th century. In the 17th century,
before Plag Mincha or before
Mincha, before Plag Mincha, Ma'ariv after Plag Mincha, but that gives you plenty of time to get home before it gets dark. In the 17th century, for various reasons, we have the first breakaway minyan in Jewish history. Up until the 17th century, every community had a lockstep minhag. Everyone in the village, everyone in the town, all the Jews in the village, all the Jews in the town, all the Jews in the city, even if there were multiple synagogues, had exactly the same minhagim, exactly the same text of the siddur, exactly the same melodies. They daven at the same time. All the minhagim were lockstep uniform in the town. That was true everywhere in the Jewish world up to the 17th century. In the 17th century, we have for the first time individuals breaking away from the practice of the community and establishing minyanim to daven ma'ariv when you can simultaneously daven ma'ariv and fulfill the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. The mitzvah of Kriya Shema must be at night. The tefillah can be late in the afternoon. And therefore, individuals wanted to daven Ma'ariv at night so as to fulfill the mitzvah of Kriya Shema at the proper time, and they broke away from the main minyan. That was the first finger removed from the dike. That was the beginning of the crumbling of uniformity of practice in the Jewish communities. And that was at the beginning of the 17th century. Once this crack began, it broadened. In the course of the 17th century, there were more and more divergences from local practice. By the time you get to the end of the 17th century, there's no uniformity left in most communities. In most communities, you have people doing this and people doing, everyone's doing their own thing. And this decay in the uniformity of practice opened the door for the two principal movements in Judaism in the 18th century. Number one, it opened the door for the Hasidic movement, where Hasidim gathered around their tzaddikim, and each group followed their own minhagim, their own practices, which was unthinkable prior to the 17th century. And the crumbling of uniformity of practice also opened up the door for the other major movement of the 18th century, namely the disciples of the Gra, the Gaon Mevilna. The Gra, the Gaon Mevilna, was the first of the great rabbis who advocated fierce independence. What does that mean? According to the Gra, the correct way to decide what to do or what not to do is to study the sources and let your conclusions flow out of the sources. And if that means changing local practice, so be it. Prior to the 17th century, minhag ruled. No one would dream of deviating from local practice. So the crumbling of local practice, crumbling of uniformity of local practice opened up the door for Hasidut and also for the opponents of Hasidut, the Misnagdim, in the 18th century. In any event, people who are davening Ma'ariv at night, which today are most communities, namely they're davening after the appearance of the stars, What they should do is light candles before Ma'ariv. That's what it says in a number of Svarim. That was the practice of the Gra, to light candles before Ma'ariv. You're lighting Ner Chanukah before Ma'ariv, before Tzeit Kochavim. Just make sure there's enough oil in there to the link doesn't allow you to download the source sheet. I think it should. I tried it out myself before Shiur. It should work. In any event, light before Ma'ariv, if you're davening Ma'ariv at night. V'im lo hidlik kodem v'yigia zman tzeit kochavim. If you've not lit by that time, first you should daven and then light Ner Chanukah. The reason is as follows. There are two principles working here. Principle number one, tadir ve'eno tadir. If you have a conflict between two mitzvot, which you should do first and which you should do second, tadir, the more frequent mitzvah, always wins out. You have at the moment, you have to decide what to do first. It's now Tzeit Kochavim. It's now time to daven Ma'ariv, and it's now time to light Ner Chanukah. You have two mitzvahs before you at the moment. Which to do first? Tadir, the more frequent mitzvah, wins out. First daven Ma'ariv, and then light candles. Similarly, in other situations, we have to decide which mitzvah to do first. Choose the tadir, the more frequent mitzvah, to do first. Further, Ner Chanukah is, after all, only d'Rabbanan, and Kriya Shema at Tzeit Kochavim is Min Torah. That's another reason to prefer Ma'ariv first. V'da, and you have to know, afilu anogim tamid lahadlik achar arvis, people who always light after Ma'ariv, min hanachon sheyachinu al kol panim shemen betoch hanerot kodem tfilas Ma'ariv. If you're going to light after, at least get the Chanukiah ready before, get the candles and the oil ready, or get the wax candles ready, get everything ready before you daven Ma'ariv, so that after Ma'ariv, you'll be able to light right away without any delay, having to get your menorah, your Chanukiah set up. Okay, what we've learned so far is there are basically two theories. According to the Shulchan Aruch and the followers of the Shulchan Aruch, the correct time to light is Tzeit Kochavim. According to many others, quoted by the Mishnah Berurah, the correct time to light is Shkia. There's around a 15-minute interval between them. Some people lighting at Shkia, sunset. Some people lighting around a quarter of an hour later at Tzeit Kochavim. I say quarter of an hour, but it depends on your latitude, actually. Now, when there is a conflict, you have for some reason not lit at all until it is Tzeit Kochavim. Perhaps that's your shita, to light it Tzeit Kochavim. In any event, you have two mitzvot before you at the moment, Ma'ariv and lighting the candles. It's now time for both of them. Choose Ma'ariv first. That's what the Mishnah Berurah said. But this choice turns out to be a little bit more subtle than we've understood up to this point. The Bir Halacha, the Mishnah Berurah is really divided into three parts. There's the Mishnah Berurah itself, which is just a brief summary, a brief bottom line statement of the halacha. And on many issues, there's the Bir Halacha printed on the inside margins, which goes into greater depth on certain issues. Many issues, he has the Bir Halacha where he goes into greater depth. There's also the Shahat Tziyun at the bottom of the page, which gives the references. On this particular point, he goes into depth in the Bir Halacha. Let's see what he has to say there. The correct time to light is exactly at Tzeit Kochavim, according to that opinion. If so, tzarich iyun mishenoheg tamid l'palel b'arv b'zmano. We need a little bit further thought. about people who have the conflict of which to do first, Ma'ariv with Kriya Shema or lighting the candles. Let's look into this a little more deeply, he says. I know, what should you do? What should you do? In a deeper analysis leads to the following conclusions. It's not worth delaying Ma'ariv. Why not? Yesh ba mitzvahs Kriya Shema d'oraisa, because you have a Torah mitzvah of Kriya Shema to do. V'gam tadir kodim, it's also more frequent. Al kain, therefore, nira li, therefore it seems to me, the ish kazeh, that a person like this, a person who has chosen the opinion to light ner Chanukah et Tzeitzei Kochavim, and therefore has a conflict about which mitzvah to do first, it's surely correct that he should light before Ma'ariv. It's surely better to light before Ma'ariv. He's just told us the opposite of what he instructed us in the Mishnah Brura a few lines earlier. A few lines earlier in the Mishnah Brura, he instructed us to daven Ma'ariv first. And now he's saying, it seems to me surely correct to light candles first. Why? Because there are other opinions, which you don't normally follow. There are other opinions according to which the correct time to light is Shkia, sunset. So follow that opinion. Follow that opinion. Light a little bit earlier, a quarter of an hour earlier at sunset, and then David Ma'ariv et Tzeitzei Kochavim. You have your cake and eat it too, but you're following contradictory opinions. Fine. Follow contradictory opinions. Do Ner Chanukah the best way, according to one opinion, namely sunset. Do Ma'ariv the best way, according to the other opinion, namely Tzeitzei Kochavim. And that's the recommendation of the Mishnah Brura. Split your opinions, change horses between sunset and Tzeitzei Kochavim. Change the opinions which switch the opinions which you're following, and all will be well. Now, this is very interesting. You've probably heard, as I have heard many times, that you should be consistent. Once you've chosen a shita, once you've chosen an opinion of the poskim, you should be consistent. Maybe you'll change it to another. In the course of your life, you might change your practices. But as long as you're following one opinion, you should be consistent and follow that opinion wherever it takes you. I'm sure you've heard this. I've heard this many times. And here we see the Mishnah Brura recommending exactly the opposite. Here we see the Mishnah Brura recommending following two contradictory opinions with an interval of around 15, 20 minutes between them. That calls for some kind of explanation. Here goes. What we're talking about is the ideal best way to fulfill a mitzvah. How to be mahmir, how to do a hidur. We're talking about how to do the mitzvah in the best way. As far as tefillah is concerned, ma'ariv, it's true that through the generations, all the Jews, including the greatest rabbis, were davening ma'ariv before sunset. But a better way to do it, more mahmir, more hidur, would be to daven at Tzeitzei Kochavim. And many people want to do that. I understand the impulse. I understand the drive to try to do the mitzvah in the best way possible. But sometimes fulfilling the mitzvah in the best way possible interferes with some other mitzvah. Indeed, it doesn't sometimes interfere. Almost always, you name the Humra, You name the hidur, and with a little bit of thought, we'll think of a way that somewhere, somehow, sometime, that humra, that hidur, fulfilling a mitzvah the best way you can, will sometime, somewhere, somehow contradict some other mitzvah, interfere with some other mitzvah. It always happens. It's inevitable. Now, once we know about this problem, once we know that a humra, a strict position, as commendable as it may be, at some point in time is probably going to come in conflict with some other mitzvah, we need some guidance about what to do. If I give you one or two other examples, you'll be able to multiply examples endlessly yourself. I have certain hidurim, certain chumrot that I wish to follow in kashrut. That's good. That's commendable. Well, fulfill the mitzvah of kashrut in the best way possible. That's fine. But it's going to block me from honoring my parents. You name the chumrah, somewhere, somehow, sometime, it's going to conflict with some other mitzvah. It just requires a little bit of thought to see how these cases will arise. What to do? Now, I know, indeed, I even have, even in my family, I have people who insist on ending Shabbos very late. Calendars usually give 2 times for the ending of Shabbos. The normal Tzeta Kochavim, when the stars appear, and then Rabbeinu Tam has a much later theory about when Shabbos is over. Well, of course, many people are following the stricter opinion of Rabbeinu Tam and ending Shabbos later. Well, that's good. I mean, that's commendable for fulfilling the mitzvah of Shabbos in the best possible way, keeping Shabbos according to the maximal shita of Rabbeinu Tam. I can smile on that. That's a nice idea, but at least one Shabbos per year. That means when Shabbos is over, you're going to be lighting Ner Hanukkah later than the ideal time. The Shulchan Aruch told us, don't delay. Light Ner Hanukkah on time. Well, of course, you have to wait until Shabbos is over. But do you have to be mahmir and wait until the latest time Shabbos is over? By being mahmir and doing Shabbos with a hidur the best way, you end up being lenient about Ner Hanukkah. These conflicts always arise somewhere, somehow. I'll give you my favorite example. The example of the Marasham. There are 2 shohatim in town. In one of these villages in wherever. There are 2 shohatim in town. And one of them, I'm a little bit shaky. I'm a little bit nervous about eating the meat from that shochet. I don't trust him so much. It's true, the Rav of the town gave the hechsher to both of the shochatim, but there's one shochet that I prefer. The shochet I prefer is really great. And he's really great. The other one's nothing wrong with him. I mean, it is kosher. The rabbi says it's okay, but I prefer this shochet. This shochet is really superb. And I only eat the meat from this really superb shochet. Now I'm invited to a simcha, to a chasana, whatever, and the food they're serving happens to be the meat from the other shochet. And I, of course, now have a problem. In general, I keep kosher to the strictest possible standards. Only that superb shochet. The other one is kosher, but not so great. Now, if I refrain from eating the meal in the chasana, I run the risk of, number 1, embarrassing the hosts. Number 2, alienating the other participants in the simcha who are going to say, what, it's not kosher enough for you? And even worse, I'm going to be insulting the Rav who gave the hechsher to the other shochet because he really is kosher, just not as good as the guy I prefer. Well, you see, the hidur, the humra, the strictest fulfillment of one mitzvah ends up in conflict with a number of other things. It happens all the time. Let's see what the Tzitz Eliezer says about this, and this I hope will give us some guidance. B'chol haTorah kula. The question which he was asked: Im mitzad adin halacha de tefila kevatikim hi rak mitzvah min hamuvcha utefila b'tzibur kodemes. Some people, like me, like to get up at dawn and daven Shacharis before sunrise. As we begin davening Shacharis before sunrise, and we begin the Shmona Esrei, the Amidah, the silent tefillah, exactly at sunrise. That's what the Gemara calls tefillah kevatikim. That's the way the Vatikim used to daven, and that's the best time to daven Shacharit, beginning the Amidah, the silent prayer, the Shmona Esrei, at exactly the moment when the sun rises. So that's a Humra, that's a hidur. That's nice. I mean, I like to think of myself as being stricter than strict can be. You know, surely holier than thou. That's what I do. It. I get up early because it's better. On the other hand, tefillah b'tzibur is also important. Tefillah b'tzibur is also important. What happens if you get up at dawn, you make your way to the synagogue, and this morning, it doesn't happen to be a minyan in shul? It's hard to get people up that early in the morning. Now I have a choice. I can daven without a minyan at the best time, or I can hang around and wait and daven later with a tzibur, with a minyan, but it won't be the optimal time. You see, my Humra, my strict practice, my striving for perfection to daven exactly at sunrise might lead to a leniency. Well, I have to daven without a minyan. Maybe there won't be a minyan in shul. How is it possible for someone to take upon himself this chumrah, this hidur of davening at Tzeit Kochavim, when it will inevitably, some point in time, at some mornings, this person is going to end up being very lenient and davening without a minyan? Well, that's not the only example. He goes on with the question. There are plenty of examples where people are mahmir, people are strict above and beyond what halacha requires. Maybe lifamim lizalzel bedin, and the chumrah occasionally leads to improper fulfillment of other mitzvahs. For example, Inyan hatchalat alayla shebe'eretz Yisrael minhag hamekubal lifsok shelo k'Rabbeinu Tam gam l'kulu. In Eretz Yisrael, just about everyone is not following Rabbeinu Tam. Just about everyone is beginning Shabbos and ending Shabbos according to the other opinion, where Shabbos ends earlier and Shabbos begins a bit earlier at sunset. Yesh machmirim b'motzi Shabbos. Everyone knows that on Motzi Shabbos, some people are strict and wait until Rabbeinu Tam. Dochin lemashal et adin shalchiv haktamat ner Chanukah b'motzi Shabbos. On Motzi Shabbos, they're going to be lighting ner Chanukah too late. Are you allowed to do that? Are you allowed to lower the level of fulfillment of the mitzvah of ner Chanukah just because you want to be mahmir, just because you want to be stricter in another area? Lefamim chumra nogat lichvod avdeim. Sometimes a Humra that you might wish to follow will interfere with honoring your parents. Or maybe your Humra, maybe your strict position will interfere with relations with other Jews. Maybe your Humra is going to make tension with your spouse. Like Humras are nice, but like what happened to Shlom Bayit? What happens when your Humra interferes with Shlom Bayit? Your spouse is not happy with your Humra. No one said you have to be machmir, but you want to be. B'nei Beito, maybe other members of your household are going to be unhappy with your Humra, and who gives you the right to make them suffer just because you want to be stricter? Orchim, what happens when you have guests? If your Humra is going to make life more difficult for guests in the house, well, that's not the best way to do Hachnasas Orchim. The best way to do Hachnasas Orchim, the mitzvah of having guests, is not to scream at them and shake your finger at them and rebuke them for not following your Humras. That's no good. Another example, Misupar Alagon Reb Yisrael Salant was the great founder of the Musar movement in Lithuania. And the story is told about him. It says in the Gemara that when you do Netilas Yadayim before eating bread, it's a hidur to use shefamayim. It's a hidur to use a lot of water. Minimally, you should use a revius, 86 cubic centimeters, not very much, but it's a hidur. It's preferable to use shefamayim, a lot of water. And of course, Rabbi Yisrael Salant used a lot of water, a big natla when he did netilas yadayim for eating bread. But when he was in someone's house and he heard that the servant girl had to go to the well and draw the water that they were using for netilas yadayim, she had to schlep the water from the well. Rabbi Yisrael Salant used the minimum possible shiur for water, for washing, so as not to make extra work for the servant girl who had to schlep the water. After bivadai tamid, of course, if he's not imposing a burden on others, he would always be strict for himself and use shefamayim, a lot of water. I, for better or worse, I'm a very cynical person. My cynicism is a great burden upon my shoulders, which I guess I must just learn to live with. But in my cynicism, I always find myself asking the following question. Oh, so-and-so is so mahmir, so-and-so is such a tzaddik. He doesn't eat anything outside of the sukkah. He would not drink a drop of water outside the sukkah. Oh, he's such a tzaddik. Of course, it's Mrs. Tzaddik who does all the work of preparing the food and bringing it to him, right? The burden is entirely on Mrs. Tzaddik. Well, a cynical person like me wonders, what exactly is going on here? And that's exactly the problem which the Tzitz Eliezer is bothered with here. Your Humra, your strict position, should not come in conflict with how you relate to other people. And if the burden of your Humra is going to fall on others, what right do you have to impose a burden on others just because you want to fulfill a mitzvah in a better way? The son of the Chafetz Chaim tells the following story about his father. Chafetz Chaim needs no introduction. He is the author of the Mishnah Berurah, one of the great tzaddikim of the 20th century. Tamid lo achal shvuya Pesach. The son of the Mishnah Berurah, the son of the Chafetz Chaim says, My father was mahmir never to eat gebrokt, never to eat matzah shruya on Pesach. He always ate plain matzah, never put matzah in the soup, never spread anything on the matzah. Surely never ate matzah brai, only pure, dry matzah. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this Humra. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this strict practice. Many people follow this strict practice today. Pamachat once hit areach etzlo krovo. Once some relative was visiting the Chavetz Chaim on Pesach. Adam Chashuv, important visitor, a relative. Lo chichmir v'achal l'chvodo. This relative, during the meal on Pesach, takes the matzah, breaks it up, and puts it in the chicken soup. Now the Chavetz Chaim has a choice here. He can explode in fury and say, no, we don't do that in this household. We are machmir. In which case, the guest is not going to feel good. What did he do? The Chavetz Chaim put matzah in his own soup. Ki krovo lo yachmir b'zeh. In order not to embarrass, in order not to put any pressure, in order not to make the guest feel uncomfortable. Here, his Humra would have imposed a burden on the guest. The guest would have felt bad. Well, we can't have that. Lo niresh tiro b'fnei shlosha. Now the key question comes. You know, these Lithuanian poskim will always find a way to identify the key halachic issue. You know the story in the Gemara of the Talmidim who were learning Torah while a bird flew overhead. Vehevel pihem, the heat of the words of Torah coming out of the mouths of the Talmidim was enough to incinerate the birds that were flying overhead. And that's, of course, the well-known story in the Gemara. You might relate to this story the way Hasidim do, as illustrating the high level of tzidkut, the high level of ruchaniyut, which the Talmidim achieved, that the heat of the words coming out of their mouths while they were learning Torah was capable of incinerating the birds. But of course, the Lithuanian posek is more interested in a different question. Do they have to pay? Do the Talmidim have to pay for having destroyed those birds? If those birds belonged to someone, are the Talmidim guilty of having damaged someone's property if those birds belong to someone? Well, you see, the posek always finds the way to bring the issue down to a concrete halachic question. Was the Chavetz Chaim required to do hataras nedarim before he put the matzah into the soup and ate it? Was Reb Yisrael Salant required to do hataras nedarim before he washed his hands with just the minimum amount of water, and so forth and so on? What happens when you have a conflict between a Humra and some other Torah principle? Well, you have to forego the Humra, but does that require hataras nedarim? Tshuva, his answer: B'chol kegonda, in any case like this, ein sarich afilu hatar, you don't need hataras nedarim. Mipnei shezeh, mikevan shezeh lo begeder neder ela begeder minhag, lo chal lechatchila minhag zeh alav b'makom shel mitnakesh im srach isur. Anyone who accepts upon himself, anyone who accepts upon herself a hidur, a humra, of course has in mind that the humra, as commendable as it is, as praiseworthy as it is, should never adversely affect another mitzvah of the Torah. Ze lo garua b'masha matzina b'rosh. The Rosh, the Rabbeinu Asher, from the end of the Balei Tosafos, explains the basis of this idea. He writes, in connection with the minhag, in connection with minhagim, afilu minhag sha'asu l'siag harchaka yachol lavo mimeno kilkul. Of course, any minhag, any chumrah, those are two ways of saying the same thing. Any minhag, any chumrah, two ways of saying the same thing. Any minhag, any chumrah, of course, at some point in time, is going to lead to a kilkul, something bad happening. Yesh levatel haminhag, just skip the minhag, skip the chumrah. You don't need hataras nedarim. Why? Because anyone who has accepted upon himself or upon herself a strict practice must do so, must be understood to have done so with the condition that the strict practice will not ruin another mitzvah. Imkein don mina, draw conclusions from this as follows. Hu hadin kishe b'meshech hazman, it follows that if in the course of time, it follows that if in the course of the time, your minhag, your humra, your hidur, as commendable and praiseworthy as it is, if your practice in the course of the time conflicts with some other mitzvah, even if it's only a chashash, a fear that your practice will conflict with another mitzvah, Amrina namisha mikara lo chal al kagon zeh. When you accepted the chumrah upon yourself, when you accepted the minhag upon yourself, when you accepted the hidur upon yourself, of course you didn't accept it upon yourself in a situation where it would ruin another mitzvah. And therefore, when the conflict arises, just drop your chumrah, just skip your hidur, and do what has to be done in order to fulfill the other mitzvah in the best way. You're permitted to violate your strict practice. You're permitted to violate your chumrah, your hidur. That's what you should do in order to fulfill the other mitzvah. Now, even a more explicit source is in the Pri Chadash. Pri Chadash was Rav de Silva. He was the big name in the 18th century Turkey. He was the leading Rav there. He writes as follows. These are his words. Da, you have to know, shekol minhag, ben shel yachid, ben shel rabim, whether it's a private personal minhag, it's another way of saying chumrah, whether it's a private personal chumrah, whether it's a private personal minhag, or shel rabim, or minhag of the community, ha'asui l'syag or l'geder, minhag is good, it's commendable, it was made, introduced as a fence around the law so that people will be more holy. Tzarich sheyeh lo yesod v'tamlu minhag. There has to be a good basis for it. V'chein, and im yesh chashash me'oto minhag yistarech shum isur, whenever there's a chashash, whenever there's a fear, whenever there's a possibility that the minhag is going to lead to something prohibited happening, like embarrassing someone, mivat linen lay, you just cancel the strict position. Any minhag, which is going to adversely affect the performance of another mitzvah, or chas v'shalom, lead to a prohibition being violated, lo have minhaga, has no status at all. Those are the words of the Pri Chadash. The words of the Pri Chadash, the words of the Rosh, lead the Tzitz Eliezer to the conclusion that as commendable as your Humra is, your minhag, your hidur, if it's going to lead to a chashash, the possibility of violating something else, just drop your strict practice. That is the position. Harei mefurash b'divrei Pri Chadash degama minhag shel yachid, and Pri Chadash makes clear that it makes no difference whether we're talking about a personal private Humra or Minhag HaMokom, a community-wide practice, Im Yotzei Al Yado Ketzat Hefsed Mitzvah, if the frum practice is going to somehow adversely affect another mitzvah, or Chas v'Shalom an Isur, it's not a minhag, we cancel it. Hagam du asui l'syag v'geda, even though the minhag was correct to start, even though the Humra was correct to start, because it's going to allow you to rise in Kedusha, it'll keep you further away from sin. Of course, no minhag, no Humra, no hidur can operate in a place, can be valid in a place where it's going to interfere with other mitzvahs. Therefore, we have to draw the following conclusion. Of course, an individual should just suppress his own or her own chumrot, own minhagim or hidurim, if there's a fear that you'll end up violating some mitzvah, or katzat hefsed mitzvah, even if you're going to be just damaging the performance of another mitzvah. Since accepting upon yourself the minhag, the strict practice in the first place, had to be conditional on it's not ruining anything else in Torah. This explains what the Chavetz Chaim did. This explains what Rav Yisrael Salant did. They violated their personal minhagim, where there was a possibility that they would be imposing a burden on others, because the mitzvah ben Adam v'chavero, the mitzvah between man and man, had to be maintained. We cannot injure, we cannot damage the performance of that mitzvah, and therefore they just dropped their chumrot in that situation. Following that, the next day they just returned to their humra, to their hidur, to their ideal way of performing the mitzvah. Well, what do we have? Number one, two basic theories about when to light Ner Hanukkah. According to Shulchan Aruch, Tzeitek Orchadim, and many people are following that. According to other opinions quoted by the Mishnah Brura, Shkia, sunset, earlier. Now, of course, the earlier time Shkia was among those who followed the earlier time was the Gra, the Gaon Mevilna. Mishnah Brura mentioned him explicitly as being one of those lighting at Shkia, at sunset, the earlier time. And as you know, the Ashkenaz community in Eretz Yisrael, especially in Yerushalayim, the Ashkenaz community was founded primarily by disciples of the Gra, the Gaon Mevilna, and therefore among the Prussian, among the Ashkenaz Jews in Yerushalayim, who were the descendants and followers of the first Ashkenaz settlers who came here, namely the disciples of the Gra. It's very common in Yerushalayim to see people lighting at sunset. In my holy neighborhood, it's I didn't count up, but I wouldn't be surprised if a majority of the people are doing it. On the other hand, the other minhag also exists. So we've learned that there are two opinions regarding the ideal time to light, but whichever opinion you follow, that's the time you should light, which means, incidentally, that you should schedule your social life in a way that you can fulfill the mitzvah of Ner Hanukkah at the ideal time. We learned last week that Ner Hanukkah is a mitzvah of your residence, rather like mezuzah is a mitzvah of your residence. Just like you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of mezuzah if you happen to be visiting in someone else's home. You cannot put the mezuzah in someone else's home where you happen to be visiting at the moment. It's your home, it's your residence, which requires mezuzah. Similarly, it's your home, which requires Ner Hanukkah. And therefore, if your social schedule is going to keep you out of the house on Hanukkah, you should schedule your social events in a way that you can be at home to light Ner Hanukkah at the ideal time. Well, it's not always possible, not always possible. And what we're going to deal with next week is the following question. What should you do if you're unable to be at home and light Ner Hanukkah at the ideal time, whichever opinion you follow, at sunset or at the appearance of the stars? Is it better to appoint a shliach, an agent, a representative who will light for you in your home at the present time in your absence? Or is it better to wait until you get home and light later at night when it's not the ideal time? The Shulchan Aruch told us, don't delay. Well, next week, we'll speak about this. And technically speaking, the name of the conflict is as follows. The Gemara says, Mitzvah bo yotem b'shlucho. It's always better to fulfill a mitzvah yourself rather than having an agent fulfill it for you. For example, well, the example of the Gemara is getting married. Getting married takes two people, a chatan and a kala. He puts the ring on her finger. That's the act which makes the wedding, which is, of course, a big mitzvah. What happens if he cannot attend the chuppah? She's stuck in Iraq and cannot get an exit visa. He is outside of Iraq, and if they can get married, then they'll be legally married, and then she can get an exit visa and come and join him. What if he cannot be present? Or a few years ago, there's a famous case in Israel of someone who was in jail and wanted to get married, and the authorities in Israel would not permit the marriage to take place in jail. So he appointed a shliach. He made his father the agent to put the ring on her finger. What if she cannot attend the chuppah? Well, she can appoint an agent to receive the ring for her. When the shliach operates, it's the principal, the person who sent the shliach, who has the status of having done the mitzvah. If you send a shliach, an agent, to buy tomatoes in the shuk, in the marketplace, the tomatoes don't belong to the shliach. They belong to the principal, the person who sent the shliach. Well, in theory, he could have a shliach at the chuppah. She could have a shliach at the chuppah. His representative could put the ring on her representative's hand, and then they're married in absentia. Neither one was present at the chuppah. The Gemara says, "Mitzvah bo yotem b'shlucho." If you can, do the mitzvah yourself and don't have someone do it for you. It's preferable to do yourself. On the other hand, it's also preferable to light at the correct time. What to do if you have before you the choice of lighting at the correct time by a shliach or lighting later by yourself. We'll talk about that next week. I'm going to pause here and let me ask you if you have any questions that you wish to ask at this time. All is well.
For Kodem Kol, thank you so much, Rav Fink, as always. Rav Fink, thanks. I had a couple questions, so I'll limit them. So is a Humra really this serious, elevated, sacred thing that's possibly not supposed to be very common in each and every household?
Well, times change. Nowadays, Humra is in fashion. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, it's not my place to decide whether it's good or bad, but nowadays it's very fashionable.
And then in the 17th century, when you mentioned that there was a split, was it only the Ashkenazi communities, the Sephardi communities that were in lockstep, or was it just the whole Jewish world?
Ashkenaz. To this very day, most Sephardic synagogues are davening Ma'ariv before sunset, which incidentally is true. When I say Ashkenaz, East European Ashkenaz, German, Central European, German Jewish synagogues to this day are davening Ma'ariv before sunset. It's an East European thing.
And this might actually be a whole shiur, so I don't know. But why is minhag equal to Humra, Humra equal to minhag? I actually have never heard that before.
Let's leave that for a discussion of minhagim and Humrot in general.
Thank you so much, Rav Fink.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for attending. I wish you all a good week and eventually a Shabbat Shalom. Look forward to seeing you again. And next week is still before Hanukkah. We'll be still dealing with Hanukkah issues next week. Until then, Shalom, Shalom.
Go to Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.